Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. In today's episode, Jonathan Scott and Jen Farello invite Derek Neiding, our Vice President of Sales and also Razorleaf's very first employee, to join the discussion to explore if PLM systems are really just another engineering system or if it is something else. Derek shares his take on what happens when organizations view it as an engineering system, as well as the different impact PLM can have when it is viewed strategically. And here's Jonathan, Jen, and Derek.
Welcome back to Stay Sharp. In earlier episodes, we have talked about the various business systems that every manufacturing business needs. And recently, we talked about PLM and the differences between PLM and PDM. One of the things that really came out in that conversation was the fact that PLM was almost an evolution of PDM. PDM was very engineering department focused, and PLM was as we moved out of engineering and into other departments. One of the things we wanted to dig down a little bit deeper on is PLM actually an engineering system, or is it something that is much broader than that?
That's right, Jen. I mean, it's a tricky question, right? Because by definition, as we talked about when we were talking about PDM and PLM, it should be dealing with more of the enterprise. But, you look at it in practice today and it kind of makes you scratch your head and go, well, really? Is it?
It does seem very focused still in engineering. Well, we have a topical expert with us today, one of our colleagues, Derek Neiding. Derek, would you like to introduce yourself to the crowd?
Thanks, Jen and Jonathan, for having me. So, my name's Derek Neiding. I'm the VP of Sales at Razorleaf. My career in the PLM and engineering world started as I was a mechanical designer for a med device company. And so I worked myself on respiratory equipment, so oxygen concentrators, nebulizers, liquid oxygen delivery systems. And during that time, as you can imagine, being a medical devices company, lots of processes, lots of rules, lots of documentation. And so I enjoyed that. I thought that was interesting. And during my early career, because I was someone responsible for producing some of those reports and doing some of that research, I started writing little apps and tools and different things like that to try to help us to produce and to automate our processes. And eventually wrote a pretty comprehensive engineering change tracking system that we used. And I found that I really liked that. I really liked understanding the process and applying technology to try to make the process easier or more automated or more enforceable. And that's when I met 𝙈𝙀𝘍𝙍𝙍, our CEO. Eric was the vice president at a reseller, and I went and worked for him for 2 years. And then he started Razorleaf, and he asked me to join Razorleaf. I was the first employee of Razorleaf. And since I've been at Razorleaf, I've had a lot of various roles in the 23 years that I've been here. Of course, in the beginning, I was a PLM consultant and helped with our kind of traditional fundamental PLM consulting. Spent some time running our product development team. We did quite a bit of SharePoint customization and automation at one point, and I was involved in that. We had a business unit that did ERP and SAP automation, and I was involved in that. And then about, probably 7, 8, 9 years ago, I got on the sales side of the organization. And I found that really kind of takes me back to my roots, because I get to talk to our clients and our prospects. I get to understand what their processes are, what their process challenges are. And then I get to go back to what I love doing, which is what technologies out there can be used to help you with your processes. And so that's what I've been doing for the last few years. I love doing it, and it keeps me sharp with the technology and allows me to have lots of good, exciting conversations with our prospects and clients as well.
Well, that makes you perfect.
Yeah, I was going to say, you really have seen the problem from all of the different perspectives.
I think so.
And that makes you perfect, Derek, for the conversation today, right? I mean, having seen it from all those perspectives and being inside of engineering at one point, but yet, talking to lots of other groups inside companies today, I think, well, I hope you have an opinion on this and a viewpoint on this. When you think about it, what do you think about our topic and our question? Like, what's on your mind when you hear us say, well, is PLM really an engineering system?
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect topic. And, my background is in engineering, and we did PDM and PLM things at the company I worked for. And much of it started with engineering. And so it's a valid question. It's a question that's probably on the top of a lot of people's mind, and I think it's worth talking about.
So, out of curiosity, when you were getting started, or when any of our customers and partners are getting started in this process, what are some factors that actually move a company from doing PLM? If you've listened to any of our previous podcasts, the caveman on the wall, was doing PLM. Everyone does PLM. What drives a company to acquire or implement a PLM system itself?
Well, this is going to sound a little bit self-serving, but first of all, I think everybody needs PLM. I don't really care what you make or how complex it is, but I think everybody does need PLM. But when do people start to realize that they need PLM and really start to go after that initiative? Early in my career, it was easy. We were a medical devices company, and the FDA told us we had to have processes and we had to have documentation and we had to have enforceable things. And so it was pretty obvious that we needed systems. So I think that can be a factor that influences a company to make those decisions, is as they start to look at maybe the industry that they're in, the clients that they're serving, the types of products that they make, that sometimes the complexity and the formality and maybe the regulatory issues behind it, that may cause them to say that, yeah, we really need to consider a PLM system. So I think that's one factor. I think another factor can be kind of a company's vision and their path of growth. So companies that are going to plan on embarking on a lot of mergers and acquisitions, as you bring in new pieces of your company, how are they going to follow the processes? How are they going to know the processes? How are we going to adapt their processes to our processes? Those are the sort of things that PLM systems can do. I think as a company is looking at maybe what their growth plans are, maybe we want to get into new markets, but we don't necessarily want to grow the people at the rate that we're trying to grow our market share. And so how do we do that? Well, you have to be able to do your processes quicker, leaner. And so those sort of things would lead someone to say that, I think we need to start looking at a PLM system.
Yeah, and it's funny, Derek, as I hear you say that, about some of the reasons people look at it, I hear, half are engineering related, right? And could be the processes inside engineering. And then some really have nothing to do with engineering. Like you said, mergers and acquisitions or growth of new product, new markets, things like that. It's like, well, those aren't necessarily driven by engineering. So, I hear both in what you're saying there.
Yeah, that's kind of the topic at hand, right? Because so that helps us to appreciate the fact that there are a number of things to consider when we're looking at selecting and rolling out a PLM system.
So what do you see? When you think about those other departments, other areas, what do they get out of it? I think you touched on a couple of things maybe, but what else do you see?
Well, so I don't think you can get away from the fact that PLM is a huge enabler for engineering. So there's no doubt about that. Whether engineering owns it or whether they should run it, we'll talk about that later. But it is certainly a huge enabler for engineering. Engineering has complex processes and complex data. And so that right there is good for engineering. But what do the other departments get out of it? Well, no one works in a silo, or at least they shouldn't, particularly when you're thinking about growth and you're thinking about mergers. We don't want to work in a silo. And so that all of that complexity that exists in engineering is consumed by others, or others are adding data to that, which makes it even more complex. So, if I'm in the quality department, which means I'm a consumer of engineering design data and documents and requirements documents, and I have to produce test reports, those test reports have to link back to something. And to have that comprehensive chain that is the vision of so many people, that's the value that I get out of the PLM system. And the same holds true when you start to get into manufacturing. And of course, manufacturing has their own systems, and sometimes those systems cross with the PLM system. And so the ability to link that data from those manufacturing systems back to the engineering and the product systems, the PLM systems, even as you start to get into other departments, again, I go back to my roots of being in a medical devices company. In our case, the legal department cared about PLM because the legal department was the one that had to answer an FDA audit and go gather all the documentation to answer the audit. So they had to go into the system or had to have access to a system that had all of the engineering change records in it. And they could understand who approved a change and who initiated a change and when the change went into effect. So even the legal department cared about that sort of stuff. So I think if you really step back and think about it, it's really not a secret that the data that goes into a PLM system is really beneficial to really almost every department out there.
It's funny. I hear echoes of that conversation that Jen just mentioned a minute ago that we've had on other episodes about everybody does PLM, but not everybody has a PLM system, right? To your point, all these other departments in a company need product data, and they're going to use it somehow and be creating their own product data. The question is, should they be in the PLM system, right? Is that the one they should use? And I think you also touched on that when you said manufacturing. You're like, well, sometimes manufacturing will have their own systems. And that could be true of lots of departments. That's a place where I think it gets interesting is if other groups have their own systems, what does that mean about the PLM system? And I don't know. I mean, it feeds another thought in my mind, like Jen was asking a second ago. Companies needing PLM and picking PLM, what do you see when companies go to pick PLM? Do they bring multiple departments to the table? Is it good when they do that, or is it bad when they do that if everybody thinks they need the PLM?
Yeah. So your question asks, what do we see? But I'd like to answer it as, what would we like to see?
What should we see?
Because what we see is often it is the selection of a PLM system and the implementation of a PLM system is very department focused. Jen asked the question earlier about, or one of you did, about what factors cause someone to start looking at PLM. And one factor I didn't mention was sometimes there's an event within a company. So the event could be, an FDA audit, an FDA failure. The event could be some acquisition. The event could be the obsolescence of a product. And so these things are like, oh, we need a system because look how complicated this is.
Failed product launch, delay to market, or who knows, right?
Exactly. So that is one of the things that can cause someone to start looking at a PLM system. And so here's the thing, tying it back to your question. When that happens, often the department that is closest to the ramifications of that failure are the one that start the look for the PLM product, right? So if engineering had a quality issue, a product issue because of bad design, because of poor testing, and they say, well, we need to fix this, well, then they're going to be the ones that go after the PLM system. So your question was what do we see? Well, that's what we usually see, is we usually do see that it is driven by a group of people, a department. It's somewhat focused. I don't think that's necessarily the best thing, because I think and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go, but I think it causes you to start to choose a system that fixes, one problem, but maybe doesn't go beyond that. We sometimes use the term localized optimization. So I've got this event, I need to solve it. So I go out and look for solutions and I find a great solution to that event. And so that's the solution we put in place. But we haven't thought about, well, what happens when it's time to get quality on board? What happens when it's time to get manufacturing on board? Maybe the system is great for engineering, but it's not so good for those. Maybe it can't even do those things. And so now what?
Right. I mean, there's another one I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we see this one a fair amount too, of I've outgrown my PDM system. Oh, I need something more, that kind of thing. But it seems like it's the same sort of problem. Whatever it is that I need that's more is the thing I'm focused on, and it's not take a step back and think about not just tomorrow's problem, but next week's problem, next month's problem, and the bigger picture.
That's exactly right. Yep. And so, I think what we would like to see is, I don't think you're going to change the fact that often the driver to start to look for one of these systems is some sort of event. You're not going to change that fact. But what we would like to see is when that happens, that you step back and you say, okay, let's make sure we get something that helps us with this immediate need. But to your point, Jonathan, what else are we going to need? What's the future look like? Let's look at something that's more comprehensive. Now, I'm not suggesting that every PLM implementation needs to be an enterprise top to bottom PLM implementation that you better touch every department or you failed at your implementation. You can still implement the system to solve the immediate need, but we've got a system that can grow. So I think of the analogy that I like to use is, if I'm a manufacturing company, I've outgrown my manufacturing facility, and I say, well, it's 1,000 square feet today, and I need it to be 2,000 square feet tomorrow. So I go out and I buy some land to build that 2,000 square foot facility. What happens in 4 years when it needs to be 4,000 square feet? And I only bought a small plot of land. What would have made more sense is to buy a much larger plot of land, just build your 2,000 square foot facility, but have enough land that as we grow, we can continue to utilize that. So in the same vein, in the PLM system, you can solve the immediate problem. There's nothing wrong with that. No shame in doing that. But have you chosen a solution that solves the immediate problem and has the room to grow to solve the future problem?
Well, and I'm going to join on your analogy there and say, and did you ask maybe the other people in your business, other people you work with, are we going to need more than 2,000 square feet? Just make sure you're talking.
Yeah, or more than 4,000 square feet.
Right.
If we grow to that point, what else are we going to need?
Yeah. I think that often is not the view that people take. And some of it is understandable. I mean, people are busy, they're overworked. If I have a problem at work and I need to solve that problem, I want to solve it as quick as possible and get back to my day job. Most of these engineers or engineering managers or directors are not, dying to become PLM analysts.
Yeah,
like we were, but
right.
So they don't want to. They don't want to necessarily. So I totally get it. I totally get why you would focus on your problem. Let me get my problem solved. But I think you end up painting yourself into a corner, and it's a decision that you could very well regret in the future.
Is there another problem in there? And I'm asking this because I am an engineer, and I probably contributed to this problem. I know I did when I was in industry. But is there a problem that some of the other groups who might be the ones to add that insight or that awareness of like, hey, we could use this in a PLM system or that in a PLM system, that sometimes they're intimidated by the way engineering, like what their requirements are, what they need, like, I can't really tell them what they need, or I can't really ask for anything because this is kind of their domain. Is that part of the problem, that the engineering stuff is intimidating?
Let me add on to that as well. As Derek, you mentioned earlier that nobody wants to work in a silo. Again, being an engineer, I would kind of counter that. A lot of times engineers are very happy in their silo. And you're, to your point, their data is complex, their processes are complex. Is that a challenge? Along the lines of what Jonathan was saying, if engineering is driving that based on their needs and their ability to solve problems, which they pride themselves on, and their belief that they'll find the right solution.
I think it certainly can be a problem. I think it can be, and I don't think that I would ever want to minimize the complexity of the engineering processes and the engineering documents. I mean, there's few files in the enterprise more complex than a parametric CAD file that has top-down assembly modeling, behavior inside of it. We know that, and so that is very complex, and I get that an engineer doesn't want to have to justify that to the guy over in quality about how we can't just use Windows Explorer to move files around. I totally get that, and I don't know that each department needs to understand the complexities of the data from other departments. I mean, is engineering data complex? It sure is. But I bet you the quality guys would argue that they've got some complex stuff in there too. And so it's not that we have to defend our complexity to another department. They have to agree that it's complex. I mean, a good PLM roadmap and a good PLM project and a good PLM selection involves a lot of experts from different groups. So, I think that if we certainly could have a case where people self-select themselves out of the process because they are intimidated by the engineering complexities. But I don't think that's necessary. I don't think you have to understand all of the engineering complexities to be a contributor to, well, what is it that I would need in a PLM system?
So what do you do when you do have multiple stakeholders at the table, either from multiple departments or maybe even inside of engineering? If you've got a complex product, like you were mentioning, and you got, people who do this kind of engineering work and that kind of engineering work, and there's hardware, there's software, all those things. What do you do when you've got maybe too many voices at the table? How do we see people successfully navigate that if they don't all see eye to eye, right? If it's, I'll give you an example, like the hardware folks want PLM and the software folks want ALM. And they say, look, we each need that, and our product is primarily this. So what do we do?
So the answer to that is really the fundamental answer to the question that we're talking about here, which is, what is the purpose of the PLM system? what are we trying to accomplish? So they certainly all do have different needs and different desires, but overall, from an enterprise perspective, what are the goals and what is the success criteria for this PLM system? And so some of that will then help us to determine, yeah, ALM folks, you do want all of those features. And unfortunately, they don't exist in kind of the leading contender. But do we need all those features? You want them, no doubt about it. But do we really need them? And how do you answer that? Well, you can only answer that by kind of going back to the mission statement of what is the purpose of the PLM system. And I mean, it's no different than any other process in life where you have to make decisions and you sometimes have to make compromises. I don't care if you're building a house or buying a car or implementing a PLM system. There's lots of options out there. And sometimes you have to, say, well, I would love to have that, but I can't for this constraint or that constraint. But this does answer the question and solves the problem I need. So this is what we're going to go with. And so I think it's necessary to do that. But here's the point, right? So our question is PLM an engineering system? If it is an engineering system, if it's driven by engineering, that's a hard conversation to have because the department that owns it is going to try to make sure that all of their needs are met. However, if it's driven and owned by the visionaries of the company, the CIO type people of the company, the people that are responsible for, leveraging technology to make the corporation a better company. It's driven by those people. Then we've kind of got a uninvested referee that can help us to have some of those conversations and decide where we should make some of those concessions. Right.
Somebody who can look out for all of the needs and weigh them against each other and that sort of thing. Because I hear what you were saying a minute ago about, you need to consider the right constraints when you're making a decision. And I think that's right. Like that's the advice certainly that I give clients when they talk about how to figure these things out. Well, first, understand your requirements. What are your real requirements? And of course, people can put desirements and wishes and things like that into the mix. But if you really can sort it out, that helps you. But to your point, there's another thing you need, right? You can understand the requirements across the breadth of an enterprise. But if there's not somebody there to play referee as you're sort of scoring against the requirements, as you're judging like, well, what's a good fit for those, you can still miss the boat and locally optimize. So it's about having the full picture, but it's about being judicious in how you find something that suits you that's important. I think we're saying the same thing there. I mean, is that what you're hearing?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, the specific features and flashy demos, those shouldn't be what guide us and what we make our decision on. It should really be based on some, I used the term earlier, the mission statement. What are we trying to solve with this PLM system? And again, sometimes that mission statement is broken down in a couple different parts. There's the immediate mission, because we had this event or this thing that happens, there's that immediate mission, but then there's a broader mission that could last over a few years. And so we want to make sure that we solve something for both of those. I mean, Jonathan, I used to do lots of PLM and PDM demos. I loved doing demos. And I pride myself in that I actually did some exciting demos. That's hard to believe that there's such a thing as an exciting PDM demo.
No, I watched them. I saw them. I believe it. There was sizzle with your steak. I totally believe it.
But see, that's the point. And of course, I did that demo for a very specific reason and for our business. But I would get people fired up, and people would get fired up about features of the PDM PLM system I was demoing, and it really didn't matter. I mean, it was neat, and I liked showing it because it got the audience fired up. But was that really what we were trying to solve? Oh, I got this 3D CAD viewer that I can spin things around and I can explode the assembly and all this sort of stuff. And meanwhile, the reason we're there is because they can't find where their last engineering change notice went to.
Right. No, but they're coming out of the room. They're coming out of the room like, well, I have to have an embedded CAD integration. I mean, Derek just showed me I have to have
That's
it.
That's right. So that's where that kind of that mission statement or that why are we here question comes up, and we need to be able to go back to that, and we need to be able to go back to that and say, okay, what do we really need? And that I think is kind of the foundation that will help us through what your question was, which was how do we deal with competing needs and competing desires through different departments or even within the same department.
Well, and one of the things that I'm hearing is that, when you talk about what are our requirements, what problems are we trying to solve, is that you can't focus just on a department, right? You can't just focus on, even if engineering is leading, or if that's where the initiative started, you can't just focus on their needs. There has to be someone over top of it looking at the business needs, not just the engineering needs.
I think that's a great summary. Yep.
And I'll say there, I think that doesn't necessarily exclude engineering from doing that, but it's about perspective, right? Engineering could still lead, but if they are looking at it as, hey, what does my manufacturing need? What do my peers, my partners need? What do we need to do in the life cycle, right? To your point about that referee, Derek, it's not to say that engineering can't play that role. It's just they have to really step away to be able to play that role. They have to look at it in an unbiased way and see how the enterprise operates to understand and collect those requirements.
So let's talk about what happens when you don't do that, because I think your point is spot on. So what happens when you don't do that? Well, engineering goes out and selects the system that solves their needs and solves it the best of any system out there. And so they put that in place. And they haven't consulted with other departments or really got the opinions of other departments. And so they've got a great system that deals with that. And so now manufacturing needs a system to deal with their needs. And by the way, some of their needs overlap engineering needs, but it doesn't really matter because engineering has their system. So manufacturing goes out and puts their system in place, and it's a great system and it solves all their needs. And now quality, the same thing happens to them. And procurement needs some engineering data, but they really can't get. You see what happens. And so what we end up with is very automated processes, but we haven't taken the time to try to make those processes better. So engineering is still working in a silo, and now they have a silo that's a lot faster and a lot flashier, and manufacturing does as well, but we haven't done anything to try to integrate those two things together. So really, at the end of the day, we may have made engineering processes better. We may have made quality processes, manufacturing processes better, but we actually may have made it harder for them to work together and for them to get data from each other. I mean, one of the values of putting all of our CAD files on a network share is everybody could get to them. It was easy. Lock them up in a PLM vault and have people try to get to them. Good luck with that. Certainly I'm not suggesting that you should just use network shares, but the point is that sometimes when you wrap a process and controls around something, you actually can make it worse. So I've told people before that the goal of implementing these sort of systems is not to make our processes just faster. It's to make our processes better. If all you do is make the processes faster and you started with a lousy process, now you get lousy processes done faster. And we don't want that. We want to get good processes done faster.
Well, and even if you make them better, to your point, I mean, you said this earlier, right? Local optimization. Local optimization is just that, and it's not necessarily what you're after. And there's some unintended consequences of local optimization sometimes.
That's right.
Thicker walls are those nice flashy silos.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. And we've seen that. We've seen cases where engineering data, we're picking on engineering, it could happen in any other department, but that's usually the department that we start working with, where engineering data gets locked up in a PLM vault, and people are like, well, I used to be able to go make my PDF files and put them in the parts book. And now I can't even get to the CAD files. How do I do that? And so, we'll give you an engineer, and every time you need a file, he'll check it out of the vault, make you a PDF, and he'll email it to you. Well, and there's an engineer saying, I don't want to do that. I never had to do that before. We didn't, and a simple conversation with the parts book people would have understood that, they need access to our drawings too. We better make sure whatever we put in place gives them access to our drawing. Simple conversation. And you know what? It may have not even chose the tool. It may not have even changed the tool that you selected. You still may have selected the same tool, but we thought about it.
It might have changed how you implemented it, right?
That's my point.
To your point,
yep.
If you didn't think about those other requirements, you created a problem. And I know exactly what you're talking about. I've seen that, right? You put the data in the vault, you lock it up, and maybe even it was in reaction to a negative event like that. Well, somebody used the wrong version of a file. Okay, that's great. Well, 12 times a week, somebody uses a file. One time, 1 year, somebody made a mistake. But now I've prevented the other 12 times a week from getting what they need and doing their job. And if you just understood that requirement, then you could have taken it into account and there's a way to open it up or whatever. But if you didn't think about it, you didn't do it. And then it's not serving everyone.
That's right.
Which gets it right back to feeling like an engineering system.
Yep.
So let me throw a question out there. There, we've been focusing primarily on PLM systems in general. But what about when it's a different department and they're taking a look at it and they're saying, you know what, we've got an ERP system. There's a PLM module to that. How does that factor into it? When you've got departments that aren't talking together necessarily, and they start going, well, why don't we just use this instead? Where's the right answer there?
So the PLM provided by a large system vendor like an ERP system should certainly not be ignored. There is a lot of value to be had by looking to those vendors. I mean, we've probably spent more money than any other system in the company on that ERP system. We probably have more resources dedicated to that system than any other system in the company. And it probably gets more attention than about any other system. So to just not look at their PLM module, it would just not be smart. I mean, you need to look at their PLM module. And those are factors that should be considered. The fact that if I were to buy a PLM system from another vendor, then maybe I have to have another team of database people and another team of network people, another team, maintaining that, where the ERP people are, maintaining the ERP system. So those factors should certainly be considered. But I don't think it changes what we've said thus far, which is that we need to step back and we need to look at what problems are we trying to solve for whatever the immediate need is and what the future needs are, and ask ourselves, does the PLM system that is offered by the ERP vendor, does it meet those needs? And if it doesn't, then we're going to have the same problems that we've been talking about, which is you're going to have a system that meets certain needs. So, we selected the PLM system from our ERP vendor, and it's great because my DBAs, when they're tuning the ERP system, they're automatically tuning the PLM system because it runs on the same database, and that's great. Yeah, but your CAD people can't check anything in or out because there is no CAD integration that's provided, and your PLM system from your ERP vendor doesn't understand parametric CAD files. So yeah, we solved some problems, but we didn't solve, maybe we even introduced some problems so I don't think you look at it any differently. I mean, when you're checking the boxes of what this system versus that system provides, the boxes under IT infrastructure maybe get checked a little quicker when it's coming from the ERP vendor. But that doesn't absolve you of the responsibility of looking at all of the boxes and treating it as one of the contenders, just like the other systems that you're looking at.
Yeah, I had a conversation with one of our partners actually the other day that related to this topic, and we were talking about buying suites or platforms or, like an ERP system that can maybe do everything for a business. And one of the challenges is that a lot of times those modules came from acquisitions. And maybe they were tailored to a certain industry or a certain type of customer, that sort of thing. And, now that the company, and again, this can apply in any case, now they sell it as a unified platform. And, the idea is that you benefit because it's all pre-integrated. And, like we're talking about with lifecycle, over the whole life cycle of a product, all the product data is in there. But then when you find out, oh, you know what? That PLM and that ERP was tailored toward the food and beverage making, and you make satellites.
Not really apples and oranges.
Right. Apples and oranges, literally, right? Maybe you saved some money because you didn't have to integrate because it's all part of a platform. But, are you going to spend years fighting that solution because it didn't meet your requirements, right? It didn't fit the bill, like you're saying.
Well, and then on top of that, you think about the level of, I don't know what the term is, let's call it respect or control that your ERP system has, right? I mean, rightly so, an ERP system is a very important system to the company. And you're not just making changes to that system willy-nilly. Oftentimes, there's a couple times a year where we're allowed to make significant changes, whether it's an upgrade or a patch or some configuration changes to our ERP system. And, if that's the software lifecycle that our PLM system now needs to be under, does that work? If our CAD vendor is releasing a new CAD version once a year, which means that CAD integrations need to be updated once a year, and the only way to update CAD integrations is to upgrade our ERP system, and the ERP folks say, no, we upgrade our ERP system once every 3 years because it's a big deal and it's a very risky proposition. So Well, that means you get to be on the old version of the CAD system for 3 years because we don't have an integration that works. And all of those new features that are coming out in the CAD system, our engineers can't use. And that's just one example, but that sort of thing should be considered. And again, I'm not suggesting that means that, well, don't use a PLM system from your ERP vendor. That's not what I'm suggesting, but we got to think about it. And we have to consider that. And is that okay with us?
And that sounds like what we're getting to overall, right? Is PLM and these PLM functions, a PLM system should be an enterprise system, right? I mean, it needs to touch everybody. And there are requirements likely from all across the company related to that product data in the life cycle. But if you do it wrong, if you come at it from the wrong angle, if you don't, broaden your view of what it needs to do for you, you might not get it right. You might implement it poorly. You might pick the wrong solution. You might just only focus on engineering needs, that sort of thing. I mean, I feel like that's how we're answering this question about, is it an engineering system? Sure, it's broader. It should be broader. And if you don't look at it right, though, you might not get that broader view.
I think that's exactly what we're saying. And I think we're also trying to remind people that looking at it broader does not mean you have to compromise your requirements and does not mean that you have to slow the process down significantly. I mean, it is going to slow the process down somewhat, but not significantly. We can get out of localized optimization without turning it into a major science experiment that takes forever and there's just no end in sight. It just takes stepping back and thinking about things. Back to our, manufacturing facility analogy. I mean, if I'm looking for land to buy, looking for land this big isn't necessarily harder than looking for land that's a lot bigger than it. You can still do that and the process is much the same, but you've got something in place that can grow with us.
And to your point, Derek, you don't have to make it, 5 times as hard if you involve 5 times the number of people or perspectives, right? You can still control the size of what you're doing and you can still grow as you go. It is just about changing perspective. It doesn't mean you have to blow it up into a huge thing.
Well, I love a podcast that comes together and actually answers the question that was posed. So PLM is more than an engineering system. PLM really is an enterprise system.
Or at least it should be.
At least it should be. Fair enough. In the ideal world, it should be. Has the capacity to be. All right. Well, Derek, thank you very much for joining us today. Your perspective and insight was extremely helpful and valuable. And I want to remind our listeners that if you have any questions about this podcast or any of the others that we've done, if you've had and have any suggestions, other topics you want to hear about, please reach out. Let us know. We want to make this a conversation. Until next time, stay sharp.
Thanks, everybody.